Welcome to the House of Lords Select Committee on AI in Weapon Systems. Our evidence today focuses on questions of accountability, capability and transparency, and I'm very glad to welcome our witnesses into this public session. In the room we have Professor Dame Muffy Calder from the University of Glasgow, of which we've already heard quite a lot about in this in our work. And in the room remotely we have Professor Gopal Ramchurn from the University of Southampton. And from the Netherlands Organisation for Applied Scientific Research, we're delighted to welcome, albeit remotely, Dr. Jurriaan van Diggelen. Thank you very much for being with us today. May I remind you, as I remind all of us, that this session is being broadcast and will be transcribed. My name is Christopher Coxworth, a Lord Spiritual and a member of the Select Committee, and I'm standing in today for our distinguished chair, Lord Liz Vane, who very much regrets that he's not able to be with us today. Following our Lord Chair's example, may I begin with a first question, which is a big question and concerns the area that we've been grappling with all along, which is agency, I suppose, in general, and what is meant by meaningful human control of machines. I have a sort of sharper version of that question, which is along the lines of we're conscious that there's evidence that over time people can become over-reliant on machine-generated recommendations. And I must admit, when I'm in my car and I've got the sat-nav on, I sometimes find myself over-relying upon it and thinking, I'm not quite sure that's right, but I'll do it anyway. Or sometimes even the opposite. No, you're always wrong, I'll do my own thing, and that's not helpful either. I just wonder, we wonder how big a concern that is in AI weapon systems and what might be done about it, that sort of bias to believe, as it were. But this is such a broad topic, and we'll need to keep relatively focused. But Professor Calder, I think you wanted to address that general question of meaningful human control, but by giving us a little bit of background that may help us conceptually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think to answer this question, I wanted to say a few words about what kind of machines or systems we're talking about here. So to my mind, these are called cyber-physical systems. And what they consist of is physical devices called sensors and actuators that are in the physical world. So they sense data and they affect actions. In the software world, there's a notion of control that does some notion of situation awareness, what situation is happening, and decision making. And those decisions will affect the sensors, perhaps where they are, how often they're communicated with, and actually control the actuators. And humans may be involved in that decision making. So we have a range from purely automated to degrees of autonomy. And two standard phrases or definitions that are used are human in the loop, where the human has the ability to stop or start these actions, or human on the loop, where the human has oversight of the whole system, but not explicit events. In either case, there are serious issues, which we will come on to later, about human involvement, boredom, challenge involved in this decision making. But just to complete the picture of the cyber-physical system, a third component is a networking, communications. So communications within the system and from the outside world to control the system. And I mention that because there may be issues of we may lose that communication. There may be issues of timing and lag. There may be issues of bandwidth and power, particularly if this system is remote. And finally, just to draw your attention to their probabilistic components throughout these systems. There's lots of uncertainty. For example, just even with sensing, sensors can degrade, they can be upgraded, they can fail, they can downright lie. And when we're dealing with rare events, it can be very difficult to distinguish between an error and something really unusual has just happened. So that's the context of those machines, and that raises two questions in my mind. The first is, what's special about a weapons system as a cyber-physical system? And the second is, what's special about AI as a probabilistic component? By the way, don't worry, my other colleagues, you'll come in. I'll leave you more time to answer questions in a minute. Just going back to what's special about a weapons system as a CPS, well, every cyber-physical system is designed for purpose and will operate in a legal framework. In this case, we have potentially destruction and harm to humans, maybe offensive, maybe defensive. What's special about it is decisions may have to be made very quickly, and there may be problems with timing and time lag. To my mind, the key actuation, the key act would be weapons firing, but that's for others to determine. The second question is, what's special about the AI component as a probabilistic component? Well, there's a couple of things. As soon as you have probability, a probabilistic behavior in a system, it becomes very hard to test and reason about it. An AI component makes that even more interesting because the AI component itself needs to be tested, and we're going to be talking about that. And the role of data in that is really, really important. So it's also then can be very tricky to monitor the behavior of that AI component within that bigger, broader software system. Two key questions for me are, where's the human agency in the system? And also, where is the AI in the system? If the AI component is controlling air conditioning, is that such a concern? If it's controlling weapons firing, I imagine it's more of a concern. So I don't mean to be flippant, but it's just to put it in context. You have to think about where is the AI component in that whole system.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether both of our other two witnesses might want to either add to that general comment, or also we ought to begin to focus on the specific question of whether there is a bias to believe and trust the system built into the sort of the human-machine dynamic.
I think Gopal has things to say.
Professor Ramchurn, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So for me, there are three elements to the issue of meaningful human control. One is reaction time. A second one is complacency. And the third one is the notion of learning from experience and whether humans are already guided by machines without realizing this. So in terms of reaction time, I think it's irresponsible to put people in situations where they have to make decisions alongside machines that are making decisions at sub-second level, right? So they have to work at machine speed, and that's irresponsible to people in those situations, and it's then difficult to ask for meaningful human control in that situation. The second thing is around complacency. If we have, for example, experience driving a car with some automated tools over long periods of time, we tend to become over-reliant on these systems. And this is particularly the case for pilots who are flying drones, for example, out there, and tend to get tired and tend to rely on the machine to make decisions in low-risk situations, and suddenly a high-risk situation arises and they're not prepared for it. So they may become complacent about what's happening in the world. And then asking for meaningful human control doesn't really account for the fact that humans do get tired. Humans do tend to become over-reliant on automation. And the third thing is, as you will know, every day you get offered suggestions on your favorite e-commerce platform or your movie streaming platform, and these machines are shaping your preferences for various products and services. And there's a real question here as to whether we are in control of our choices, whether these AI-based systems already shape our decisions. And I think that's where all these three dimensions of meaningful human control for me raise the issue of a responsible design. Are we really thinking about the whole in a holistic way about systems of humans and machines and how they form partnerships where humans and machines really influence each other's decisions. Sometimes in situations where one needs to be can react faster than the other, and these pose real problems for us, for our lawyers, for our military commanders, and for civil society.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramchurn. Professor Dr. Diggelen, I wonder whether you might come in, and could I throw another dimension in, the time dimension? We're very conscious of the speed at which all of this is operating, and also the adaptability of these weapon systems to changing circumstances. How do we retain any sort of meaningful human control at speed?
Yes, so that is an important problem for meaningful human control, especially in the military. And I believe that real-time control is one way of establishing control, where the human steps in and at real time makes decisions that are executed by the machine. But we can also shift that moment of control earlier in time, for example, in the planning phase. And that is something which we call prior control. So the human specifies a contract with the machine and thinks out all the possible events that could happen, and also specifies directives that the machine must follow in case that happens. And then the machine goes off autonomously, and when these situations arise, it will act according to the instructions that were given by the human earlier. And that is a form of control which is relatively new in human-machine interaction, but it's actually quite common in human interaction. When human teams interact with each other, they do that all the time. And you should also realize that these kinds of behaviors and the interactions, they will develop over time. What is really important then, of course, is that the human, at the moment that these instructions are given, can anticipate on how the scenario would unfold, but the human must also be aware of how the robot would act in those circumstances and which directives to give in the robot. But that way you can shift the moment of control to a moment where there's more time. Another note I would like to make on the reliance issue. Indeed, the over-reliance is an issue, but we can design for that. So we can make sure that in the interaction, the machine communicates to the human when the machine is uncertain, and that the machine sometimes maybe sees novel situations which it has not encountered before in the training set. And if we add that to the human-machine interaction, the human and the machine also gradually over time will develop calibrated trust, and they know what the machine can do and what it can't do and when to step in.
That's very, very helpful indeed. Thank you. Lord Hamilton, I think you wanted to come in.
Would very much like to come in. It strikes me that there's a contradiction in terms here, because we're talking about human control and we're talking about autonomous weapon systems. Surely by the nature of an autonomous weapon system, there is no human control. Should we not be actually talking about responsibility for the whole system, probably in the hands of some military commander, who would then pull the whole system if it wasn't operating properly?
Professor Calder.
Yeah, perhaps I'd comment. Usually, when we say autonomous system, we think about degrees of autonomy. So there's a spectrum from, as I said, fully automated to you might have some actions, some functions are automated, sets of functions, to the complete system being automated. So when I hear the word autonomous, I don't assume it is fully autonomous. And that's a really key point in these systems. To what degree do we have full autonomy? And this occurs in many paradigms, from driverless cars to medical devices, prosthetics, water networks, etc.
Thank you very much. May I bring in Lord Brown at this point, and Dr. Diggelen and Professor Ramchurn, perhaps you could hold in mind also Lord Hamilton's question as we come on to this one. Thank you, Lord Brown.
Thank you very much. So actually, I mean, I think that Dr. Van Diggelen's reference to how you can, in anticipation of these events where you may need to change the behaviour of the machine, you can program it to do this in advance. So this is exactly the space that I want to dig into, which is, I mean, we're dealing here with machines which technically, do not always, the algorithms that instruct them don't always operate in a deterministic fashion, we're told regularly. But despite being told that, an algorithm can behave markedly differently in what we perceive to be identical sets of circumstances at different times, that seems to me it causes me personally, and I think it will cause the committee a great deal of difficulty as to what recommendations we make if we're dealing with non-deterministic machines. I mean, how do we set thresholds for its behaviour? How do we put it, into a mindset? I mean, I kind of know how you do this with children as they grow up, because I've experienced, but I was never very successful. But so I just wonder, is this possible with this type of technology? I don't think we know enough about this technology and how the technology behaves and how it works as to whether we can apply these sort of human controls to it. I mean, my sense is that when people talk to me about these machines will do what is in their best interests, not necessarily in our best interests. So can we with confidence, train the machine in the same way as we can train a soldier to act instinctively in a particular way when he or it is in this set of circumstances? Honestly, the evidence we have suggests to me that we probably won't be able to do that.
Professor Ramchurn, what do you think?
Yeah, these are really good points. And I think the research shows that there are different degrees of autonomy, or as we would like to call it, flexible autonomy levels that would apply in different situations. As you rightly say, these systems are probabilistic, so they may not even correctly recognize the situation they are in to choose the right course of action. Or even if they recognize the right situation, then they might choose a random course of action that is unexpected. So in those situations, what matters really is the level of risk that you incur. If it's a low risk situation, you might be okay with a machine being automated and maybe make some mistakes that will not have a huge impact. But in high stake, high risk situations, you may want to have more control. And that's where we talk about maybe 5 or 9 different levels of autonomy, where either you ask for the machine, you code the machine to ask for permission to take action, or you code the machine to act and then tell you what has happened, or you ask the machine to do everything without telling you. Depending on the level of risk that it perceives. But then the level of risk is something that a human may be better able to judge, or could be trained into the machine, so you could learn this over multiple experiences. But I think the challenge arises when you face an unseen situation, previously unseen situation, and that's where I think it is important then to ensure that whoever is making decisions is accountable for it, and that means tracking where data is coming from, where decisions are being made either by the human or by the machine or jointly.
Thank you very much. I knew the challenge today would be to move on from question 1. We could spend our whole time on it. We do have 3, I think, bids for supplementaries on this. So would you allow me to take those together so we can sort of get them on the table, and then I'll invite brief responses to those. So Baroness Hodgson, if we could have yours.
Thank you. I'll try and be quick because I know there's a lot. You were mentioning about kind of prior control and pre-planning. And I absolutely understand about that. And often you may plan something, and then tell it when that's happened, you may want to then have further decision making in the planning. What worries me particularly is I see how efficient a machine can be for systematic decision making, but there is a lack of empathy. And I don't see how you would ever put in empathy into its decision making, and that causes me great worry, because I think in matters of conflict, there would be some form of empathy would come into the human decision making, and I don't see how this is included in machine decision making.
Thank you, Baroness Hodgson. And if we could come on to you, Lord Grugcott, and then Lord Treesman, new member of the committee, if I may invite you just to put your question on this, and then we'll see what the responses are.
Right.
Thank you, Lord Grugcott.
I think it's a pretty short question. It's just to try and get in our minds, I think, what is distinctive, in my mind anyway, what is distinctive about a weapon system that includes AI or indeed a fully autonomous weapon system, if we're talking about basically whether it works. It seems to me that a lot of this discussion is, does it do what it's intended to do? Can it be relied on to work in all circumstances or not? Now, that to me seems no different from, it's different in degree maybe, but it's not different as a principle from any other kind of weapon. I mean, I don't know, does a machine gun work better in certain temperatures than others, or is it disabled because of, I don't know, whatever factor you can imagine? But it's helpful in our thinking, at least in my thinking, if I know that the problem we're wrestling with here is not actually a brand new, unthought of problem when it comes to whether the weapon works or not, which seems to be a very crucial part of the agonising that we're doing about AI and AWS.
Thanks very much. And then to bring in Lord Treesman.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I don't have any interest to declare. Let me start, because I know I've got to start with that. And this isn't supposed to be a dystopian kind of question at all. I've been trying to draw on, I'm a mathematician by training, I've been trying to draw on past experiences running a trading floor in a large investment bank. One of the things that I observed was that many of the traders, many of them a good deal younger than me, and almost all of them mathematicians, when they were trading in derivatives, claimed to know about the mathematical bases of the operations they were doing, although it seemed to me to be very unclear that they did. They didn't seem to have a kind of an instant depth understanding of the algorithms, but nonetheless, when they were presented with various sorts of information, they gravitated very rapidly to particular solutions. And they were doing it in a very fast time frame, and this is nothing like as advanced as the AI and weapon systems that we're talking about. My question, Lord Chairman, is this: is there to any extent not just a matter of meaningful human control, but do the ways in which the machines work train the humans to respond in particular ways, rather like some of the descriptions that we've just heard about using our sat-navs when they're obviously telling us ridiculous things, but people beginning to behave almost automatically in not just the questions they ask, but the instructions they give, because that is the way they've been guided to. And is there a risk in that?
Thank you very much, Lord Treesman. So we have a clutch of questions there on the back of the determinism. There's empathy, there's distinctiveness, and there's a sort of reverse training. May I ask you to be really disciplined in your answers? You won't be able to address them all. But if we start with you, Lord Diggelen, and then we need to move on to question 2 pretty shortly. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So there's a lot to unpack here. With respect to the empathy question, I think that really hits the main point. So the question is, how much power are we willing to hand over to the machine? And there is a line to be drawn there. And for people interested in this debate and meaningful human control, the line is that the machine should not be capable of making moral decisions. Well, what does it mean to make a moral decision? That is making a decision by the machine itself, which has not been pre-planned by the machine itself, that affects human values and that might have legal consequences. Those decisions should be left to the human because indeed the machine does not have empathy and it does not have consciousness, and we are uncomfortable when the machine makes these decisions by itself. So we should make sure that the human in these cases uses this prior control. Well, what is the difference then between an AI systems and traditional systems is that the traditional systems are more acting in very deterministic ways and also in predictable environments. And the machine can also cope with unforeseen circumstances. So interpret the situation and come up with a solution itself. Well, then we should be very careful to distinguish between those decisions that the machine can perform autonomously and those decisions that are morally laden and which should be made by the human, either real time or prior. So then the last issue also which came up is the relation between human and machine, and I think the proper metaphor should be as a team partner. So the human and the machine should collaborate together, and the machine should also be aware that it should involve the human in certain circumstances, and you should also develop your team over time, and the human should also, one of these things that will develop is that the machine knows when to involve the human and when not.
Thank you very much. Impressively succinct. Professor Calder, anything you would like to add?
Yep. 3 quick points. I think, first of all, the big question is why automate at all? And typically, I think we automate when we've got a repetition or an unsafe environment we want to work. Those are reasons why we want to automate tasks. So I think we need to think about that in this context. Why are we automating? The second is, whenever we're talking about AI components, it all depends on how the component was trained and how the training data relates to the testing data, which relates to the data it's going to meet in real life. It's extremely important to consider the alignment of those. That's really going to affect the overall behavior of that component. And I would keep coming back to that question of where is the AI component in the system? And the last is maybe to say a phrase that we call as understandable AI, where the outputs of any AI system, we want them to be contextualized to support human agency. So it's back to this. So all three of us, we're talking about the same thing. It's called human autonomy teaming. How do we work together with the machine, and do we define those boundaries?
Thank you very much. I think we're learning a lot. Professor Ramchurn, anything you'd like to add on this very briefly?
Very quickly, on the notion of feedback loops, where machines are guiding humans by the decisions that they make or the information they provide. I think there's those feedback.
We just lost you there, Professor. Could you just repeat your last point?
Can you hear me?
We can now. Yeah, we just lost you for a moment.
Yeah. Very quickly, I was talking about feedback loops, how machines are now guiding humans based on the data that they've used to train and to classify images, for example. We're at risk of letting humans be guided in ways that are not suitable in certain situations. And on the notion of empathy and whether machines work or not, I think that for me the key point is who is responsible for failures of the system. When the machine has done something unacceptable or unlawful, who is actually responsible? And we are struggling a bit with that question, but it is not a matter just for this group or for ethicists or philosophers to decide on. I think it's a matter for civil society to decide on, because at the end of the day, these autonomous weapons will be used against enemies that are looking to win the war. Right, so we should be mindful of those situations which are high stakes and are likely to affect us in ways that are unpredictable.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to another question now, which sort of follows on from Lord Grocot's question about, well, does it work? Lord Hamilton.
Yes, what methods are available to ensure that AI systems will perform robustly in settings which might be different from those in which they've been trained, and to train, I would also to the original requirement? What testing systems will be needed to evaluate the performance of AI systems? And I'd like to add to that, do our witnesses agree that in all probability we will only come to a conclusion whether these systems are working as intended by going to war?
Professor Calder.
Oh boy. Just back to the testing component question. So to my mind, there's two aspects to testing here. There's testing of the AI component, which is a fairly well-defined concept of after we have trained a model, we then test it, where we have notions of ground truth so we can understand how it actually performs, and then we actually deploy it on the real data. But then that component is part of a bigger system, which may be a totally deterministic software framework, and we have to test that. So it's a coming together of two disciplines, which is called software engineering and, shall we say, data science. So it's about testing in those two different contexts.
Thank you. I don't want to ask the other witnesses to repeat what's been said, but do you have anything further to add, Professor Ramchurn?
Yes, I think there's the element of systems testing and verification that is already in place, but with the research we're doing in the UKRI Trustworthy Autonomous Systems program, what we're finding is that these testing frameworks are not suitable for AI systems that work alongside humans. The humans tend to cause most problems in some cases, as we saw with the Watchkeeper program, where most drones that were built as part of this program crashed because of human error. And that's because the design, the testing, the verification framework cannot account for human behaviors, human unpredictability. And this is the key research challenge we're trying to address right now.
Thank you. Dr. Diggelen?
Yes, so I think this is an interesting point, because a machine learning model can only make predictions based on the patterns it has seen in the training data, and it cannot generate entirely new knowledge when it hasn't seen anything before. So we should, during development, make sure that we have a diverse training set and really try to anticipate in which kind of situations this system will be used, and that our examples from that situations will be in the training set. And also during testing, we can use techniques like red teaming, that some people outside the development team try to come up with examples that could occur in practice, but which the developers did not think of and include in their training set.
Thank you. Lord Brown, did you want to come?
Can I come back?
Yes.
Because I don't think my question's really been answered. When it comes to conventional weapons, when we go to war, we discover that some conventional weapons fail in terms of what we expected of them, and some exceed what we expected of them. So surely you have to test these systems in war to know what they're really capable of and whether they are as errant as some people believe they might be.
Any responses to that?
I think I would say that in general, for any system we deploy, until we deploy it in what we call the wild, in the real world, we just don't know. We can test, we can reason, and we can analyze, but the proof of the pudding is, as they say, in the eating. It is in the actual deployment. Whatever the purpose, I keep going back to the purpose of the system, the role intended for the system.
Yes, and if I can add to that, the problem in warfare is that the enemy will try to be unpredictable. So they will try to act in a way that the system has not been trained upon.
Can I jump in, please? I think what we're getting at here, the question is really about military advantage. Does it actually give you any kind of military advantage? Does it may be working perfectly, but if you're spending a lot of time trying to fix its issues, trying to get an understanding of why it is making a decision, just so that you're accountable for what you're doing, you're wasting time, and that could put you at risk. There are a number of military personnel that have been shot down because they were looking too much at their drone mission control systems on their tablets, for example. So testing these systems in the wild at war is definitely essential before you think they actually confer any kind of military advantage.
Thank you. Lord Brown.
Yeah, I mean, I think this carries on from the question I asked earlier. I mean, there is something very significant in the last sentence of Lord Hamilton's question, which is, I mean, conflict is chaos.
You can't stay.
I mean, conflicted environments are chaotic. And we seek to train human beings to operate instinctively in those environments so that they're not distracted from their job by what's going on round about them. And we train them to relate to each other, which is why we celebrate, the fact that people will go to war not for their country or not for their king, but for their mates, right? So they will behave in a particular way. So these are chaotic environments in which we anticipate that things will change, and the enemy gets a vote. They are constantly trying to disturb those environments, and in relation to electronic equipment, they're constantly trying to beat our security and interfere with it. Right. So like the question I asked earlier. I mean, this is not what we need to be told, because we know this, right? What we need to be told is, are these machines capable of being hardened to operate in the way in which we want them to, or predict that they will, in that set of circumstances when there are built into them these inherently unpredictable behaviours? I mean, is it wise to put these machines into these environments when we don't know where in the cool of a laboratory they will guarantee to behave the same way twice?
Thank you. Who would like to come in on this critical question?
Could I perhaps... Go ahead.
Yeah, so my thoughts are that it's a very complex and interrelated complex environment, but we could try to identify well-defined context within these tasks and test our systems for these tasks, and then we can reliably deploy them. And the system of the behavior of the AI should not be very unpredictable to the human. If that is the case, then we shouldn't use it.
Do you agree, Professor Calder?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll keep going back to my point. It's where is the AI in that overall system? But I would maybe also stress we should pick apart perhaps the offensive and the defensive role for these systems. Perhaps we have different overall agreements about what we want when we're talking about a defensive weapon rather than an offensive weapon. Because as pointed out, the enemy per se is also trying to confuse us and our systems.
Thank you, Professor Ramchurn. Before I bring you in, may I layer another question from Lord Fairfax on this same theme, though?
Well, thank you. I hope it's not too general a question. It's about the advent of quantum computing. Do you see any relevance of quantum computing to these questions, or is that a red herring? And this is a question for all of you.
Professor Ramchurn,
my quick answer is red herring. I will point out there are other aspects of quantum technologies like quantum imaging, quantum sensing. They might increase our abilities to, for example, sense and actuate in terms of those systems. That could make a bigger difference, I think, than quantum computation per se.
Thank you, Professor Ramchurn.
Red herring for the moment, but I think longer term, we will look at building machine learning systems that work at a quantum level, and therefore will bring in new capabilities when it comes to autonomous weapon systems. So not for now.
Thank you. Well, I think we should move on, if we could, to question 4, Lord Sarfaraz, I think you're going to come in on this. We've already touched on this question of potential damage to data, but over to you.
Yes, so I was just wondering what mechanisms can be put into place to try and reduce the risk of sort of adversaries trying to tamper with training data right from the outset. Are there ways to mitigate or prevent this? Whoever wishes to go first.
Thank you. Dr. Diggelen?
Yeah, so I think you should, the selection of the training data should be done by the development team, and you should not just let your AI go out in the wild and collect any training data it encounters. And the development team, they should carefully see if the data has not been tampered with. So no online learning. But the enemy can tamper with reality, and that way create a mismatch between what the system has learned and what it sees in reality, and that is a real risk. The enemy will try to be unpredictable and camouflage their systems in a strange way that the AI will not recognize it.
Professor Ramchurn.
Yeah. So the real risk here is where we've got a machine learning system that is for which the training data set has been tampered with, would then result in this machine learning system misclassifying certain things. For example, a child holding a toy gun could be mistaken by the system to be a terrorist. I think that's kind of potential risk that you have with tampered training data. And data is at the core of most machine learning systems specifically. The way to solve these issues, for example, is to try and assure that data pipeline, protecting that data pipeline, and that was what the Project Maven was trying to do in the US a few years back. So securing the data pipeline, but securing the data centers on which these data sets are stored. But as my colleague just talked about, in terms of fooling these systems, there is a risk that if you're using a black box machine learning system that you don't understand how it works, you don't understand how it's learned from this training data, it could be subject to certain kinds of attacks. So you could use some of the features that it has learned from this training data, even though it's unadulterated data. Someone could use certain features of that data set to fool the system, and we've seen lots of examples of this in the literature. So there is a risk with black box machine learning systems in particular.
Professor Calder, would you be able to come in on that last question, that last point? Is there anything more you'd like to add on that, on the black box dilemma?
Gopal, I think you've said it very well. This is a classic problem of AI, is about that training data. And in a sense, the more you try and open up the black box and reveal and try to summarize what it does, you've kind of given away the game to the adversary, who can then go and poison the data. And this, if you have controlled all the data yourself, that's fine, but I think that's becoming increasingly difficult and unrealistic, and that we are having off-the-shelf components here, or we are going to, open source out on the web, etc. So it's very hard to control those data sources.
Thank you. Baroness Hodgson, on the same theme.
I think that led me into thinking about the security of the systems in general. That, I suppose the kind of whole sci-fi concept that somebody tampers with the machine and turns it back on to become on the people that are trying to use it. How could one prevent other people accessing these systems?
Should I say, so there's technical answers here, but this is also part of a bigger question of unintended uses of technology. Who thought, a jet would become a bomb, etc. We can turn any system and use it in ways that it weren't intended. Here, I'm not talking about the cybersecurity, but the system of getting into the machine and into the network is a different issue here from trying to tamper with the data that's used in the training steps. We would expect in these systems that you would be retraining them at regular intervals. Well, that's a big question, is how often are they retrained?
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on, if we may, to the next question. May I bring in Lord Clement Jones on this question, really important one about principles into operational detail.
Thank you, Chair. And it's a bit of a change of subject here, given that we've been talking about, in a sense, the nature of the weapons. It's how can the MOD translate high-level principles like reliability and responsibility to operational reality? What procedures are needed to ensure AI-enabled weapon systems will be responsibly designed and lawfully used? It's really all about compliance. And of course, what I'm thinking of is the MOD policy statement, ambitious, safe, responsible, and they're setting out of the various principles that they think should be applied: human centricity, responsibility, understanding, bias and harm mitigation. As well as the question about compliance mechanisms, you might also comment on the realism of trying to have these ethical principles as well. Can we start with Professor Calder?
Thanks. I think every organization that develops software has to face these issues. They already face them even without AI. What are the processes of developing software? How do they test? How do they verify? How are they open about the methods they use? It becomes even more acute in this context. And I think a lot of it simply comes down to culture in the organization. How professional are the people involved in developing the software? What's the culture about the transparency of the development, the deployment, the discussion of fairness, the ability to challenge? I don't mean challenge within the system, the software system they're building, but challenge within the whole software process.
I'll come to Professor Ramchurn in a minute, but so what's your view about the realism of embedding that culture in a ministry, a department devoted to defence, or indeed an armed service itself?
I suppose I don't think I'm able to comment on the cultural aspects of that particular department, but I think it comes back to the professional developed software developers. How are they being educated, and the culture in which they are working together? And I think anyone would say it's not just about the software development, but we need other specialists within those teams as well. And it's always, again, about diversity of those teams' ability to challenge each other.
Thank you. Professor Ramchurn.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on the notion of adding sort of new principles or ways of working to the development of these systems. And I think the worry there is these principles may interfere with what's already in place in a way that undermines that military advantage that they might have. So these principles have to be implemented in a way that supports those teams on the ground, and I think working with the teams on the ground who can actually build these systems very quickly, as we've seen in Ukraine. Many machine learning systems or drone-based systems were built by personnel on the ground within 2 weeks and deployed with quite a bit of success. So one thing is to make sure that these principles are implemented in an additive way to what's already in place, and that needs collaboration with people on the ground. It has to be fair to those systems who are. It has to be fair to the humans involved in these systems, and I think that's where the notion of accountability is the foundational element of all these AI-based systems to give assurance or to give comfort to the humans in that organization that when they make a decision, someone will be able to prove that they are responsible for it, or a machine has decided on their behalf within certain regulatory or legal boundaries. So a number of sort of ground up and top down approaches to, I think, implementing those principles that need to take into account the reality of the situation that people face at war.
Yes, I mean, does that, you've explained the issues. I mean, how realistic is it, do you think? I mean, we've talked about the culture and so on. How realistic do you think it is to embed those in an organisation in these circumstances?
I think that's where we need to involve not just engineers and scientists in building these systems and implementing these principles. I think involving people from different disciplinary backgrounds, whether it's social scientists, psychologists, and others who will help make sure that these systems are adhere to these principles in ways that are fair to humans and key stakeholders.
Thank you. Dr. Van Diggelen.
Yeah, so I think what is also important, that a principle like meaningful human control is not necessarily in conflict with military effectiveness. I think the military will want to keep control over their AI-based systems, but we should show them how to do that. And for that, you need these requirements to be much more precise and really spell out how they translate to training requirements over the entire life cycle of the system, how you should develop your user interfaces, how and monitor over time, etc. Because it will be difficult to do software audits, and it will also be very difficult to prove that the enemy has used their AI-based systems in a fully autonomous mode. Unlike chemical weapons, there will be no spill of chemicals or signs that they have been used autonomously.
Yes. So I mean, you talk about the training, but then. How do you make sure that once everybody's trained, that actually the principles are being put into effect? Dr.
Yeah, so That is. I agree with the previous witness. That is also a part of culture. I mean, we did that in safety research, where we understand that the whole safety culture of an organization and logging incidents and everybody being aware of these problems and trying to improve it is important to have safe systems. And the same holds for responsible AI.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know that Lord Crocott would like to come in on this as well.
Yes, we're talking a lot about principles, but Professor Ramchurn mentioned legal boundaries, and that's more our territory, really, the law as part of a legislature. And the question is, to what extent do you think that current legal frameworks, boundaries that exist, particularly, of course, international humanitarian law, to what extent there's enough there, as it were, to cover these weapons, however defined, that we still haven't got a definition of the weapons, which is a bit of a handicap. Do we need new laws? I mean, well, that's a question. I mean, obviously, I realise that any regulation would involve some international agreements, presumably, but at some point, the dear old legislature would come into this. And do you think that something new is needed or not?
May I just hold your response to that? That's an important theme, but I'd just like to move on to it in a moment. But I wanted to give Lord Brown just a chance to come in. I think you wanted to come in on the more specifics of.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in specifically how we do these things that we aspire to do. So we know that there has been no public consultation in the United Kingdom of our country's appetite for the deployment of weapon systems that can operate autonomously or semi-autonomously. We've had none. But we do have in our recent past history examples of technological advance in which we built a parallel system of studying the ethics of them. So in our country and in the United States, I can't speak for other countries, but I suspect most developed countries certainly did this. As bioengineering improved, and as the concerns that we had about its misuse or effects developed, we built a research, a parallel research system that wasn't quite funded as well as the research into the bioenergy, but looked at the bioethics. So we had this constant parallel system of bioethics in which there was this constant conversation going on. And for most of these countries, this conversation has developed into a national regulator. You know, and in the United States, there are federal regulators and state regulators in the whole bioengineering field that have come out of this bioethic discussion. I mean, the G7, our Prime Minister announced that he was going to lead global regulation of AI, and yesterday he started it, and he met with 3 people who are key figures in the AI industry in the United Kingdom for a couple of hours, so the job's done. Right, so, I mean, should we not do this? You know, these complicated conversations that we're having week after week after week with people who are drawing out these things that we're learning the vocabulary for as we go along, but have responsibility for the public policy. Should we not just take from the bioengineering example and establish an AI ethics frame of research that we put sufficient money in to start to test these things?
Professor Ramchurn?
I completely agree, and that was actually my main recommendation to this committee is to actually fund a body that would have this authority to have these conversations, to bring in the key stakeholders, and bring and work alongside the Minister of Defence to advise on and inform the public and various stakeholders about what the implications of these systems are. Currently, the conversation is owned by the media. And there's a lot of scaremongering going around, and this is led by people who are not experts in the field, or people who have formed opinions about autonomous weapon systems based on what read in a book. I think you need to have a wider conversation, because it is not just about the technical elements of these systems, but the values that we hold, the ethics that we have in our society, and this varies across different publics. So we can't just decide this across what autonomous systems we would allow, how we would allow the deployment of these systems just with a small group of people. And I think going to the tech industry and the Silicon Valley titans, as we call them, for any opinion is clearly not the right way to go. I think there's already been quite a few investments in the UK to look at responsible AI and trustworthy autonomous systems, and we are part of these initiatives, and we are looking to grow some of these groups that bring researchers from different disciplines to address these key issues. But I think something specific focused on defense and autonomous weapon systems is urgently needed to avoid this conversation being taken over by the media and non-experts in the field.
Dr. Diggelen, thank you, Professor Ramchurn. Dr. Diggelen, do you agree as well?
Yes, I totally agree, because also AI is developing constantly, and we recently have this next generation AI with the big language models and generative AI. So I would also advise don't only focus on kinetic weapon systems, because cognitive warfare is also a weapon systems, and this new generation of AI turns out to be very good to be a means to try to influence public opinion, etc. And we should also take a broad scope.
Thank you. Professor Calder?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's difficult to have meaningful conversations if they're too abstract. For me, I would be focusing on the actuation. Remember, these are cyber physical systems. The physical actions, for example, like weapons firing, if we can look at the classification of those. As I said, AI in an air conditioning system doesn't particularly bother me. Weapons firing does bother me, and I think we have to make sure the conversations include those actuation events. Otherwise, it just feels a bit navel-gazing.
Thank you very much. Let us now move on to Lord Grocot's question about international law, international humanitarian law, the translation of our ethics into operational principles, and then the holding of us and other nations to account. Who would like to come in on this to begin with? Are our legalities sufficient thus far? And then Lord Mitchell will sharpen the question up a little bit in a moment.
If I can jump in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Lord Ramchurn. Yeah. Professor Ramchurn.
Thank you. I think right now there are no laws, and it's a huge debate in the legal community around whether we should allow autonomous systems or not, and autonomous weapon systems. And question is whether we get everyone to agree when they all hold different sorts of ethics and values. For example, in Japan, people tend to have very close relationships with machines. They see them as equivalent to humans in some cases, right? They have companions. They hold machines as companions. In other countries, the UK's adversaries, they might have different views on what machines are allowed to do to humans, and therefore not want to restrict the use of these machines during warfare. So it is a difficult challenge to try and get everyone to agree on a set of rules around restricting the use of autonomous systems in specific war settings. So I think we are going to struggle to get that agreement, and we need to be mindful of the capabilities that others are developing and come up with meaningful solutions that resonate with our publics in the UK.
Can I just, we understand that there are lots of different views about this, but could I ask you, if you like, for your expert guidance as to whether you think new rules as yet not quite defined because of the difficulties you described, but do we need them or not?
The difficulty there is that if you impose rules, you need to be able to police them. And AI is no different to any other software. And if you're going to say only certain people are allowed to build software, then that's not going to be, you're not going to be able to police it. So I think it's going to be, it's difficult to impose those rules. And in particular, I think it's difficult to impose those rules when the adversaries are going to use these weapons in ways that you don't you can't control. I think it's the same thing with nuclear weapons, and you can come up to an agreement on how and when people should be able to use them at warfare. But anyone can build an AI weapon potentially these days, and that's difficult to regulate.
Lord Mitchell, I think it'd be helpful if you were to come in with your question now.
Thank you, Lord Chair. And it does lead on from what Lord Grocott was saying. What international standards of practice on development, testing and use of AI-enabled and autonomous weapon systems are needed, if any? And I have to say, I mean, when I sit on this committee and I listen to these very profound questions that we're asking that have major implications, I just sort of wonder whether the same questions are being asked in Moscow, Beijing, because this is an issue, I guess, like nuclear issues, which it takes two to tango. And we can't come to any agreements unless the same things are being done elsewhere. And I have no feel for it. So, Professor Calder, if you could kick off, please.
Thanks. I would say, are we asking the question, are they being asked in other countries? I could only assume yes. But also, are they being asked in other sectors? So to my mind, this isn't just about regulation of AI as a technology, it's about its use. We have to ask the same questions in medical devices, in driverless cars. Yeah, are you going to buy a driverless car from Moscow? Are you going to buy a medical device from China? We are facing these same issues across many sectors. And the question of regulation, of course, is quite hard in the software sector because we don't have these physical residues. Yeah, you don't. Unlike nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, it's hard to find the traces. So I think we have to go back to the culture and the people who develop the software. And a lot of that's about higher education, and about the people who are participating in those activities. But I think these are international and cross-sector questions.
Thank you. Lord Mitchell, do you want to continue? I know that Lord Hamilton would like to come in a moment, but let's continue with your questioning if you'd like to.
No, I'd just like to hear what the others would like to say. Lord Diggelen, Mr. Diggelen, what would you like to say on this?
Yes, so I think that regulation can definitely be effective. We have the AI Act developed by the European Union, which is, I think, very important to have things like that in place. We should be aware that it should develop and cope up with a new source of AI. For example, with the generative AI, there should be maybe regulations like that a human has the right to know whether he or she is talking to a machine or a human. And these are very concrete enforceable rules. In the military domain, we should see which kind of these rules are feasible and are useful to translate to the military domain. But I definitely think there's a role of legislation there.
Mr. Ramchurn?
There currently, to my knowledge, there are no well-defined standards for AI-based systems in autonomous weapons development. So I think there is an urgent need to build those sort of testing frameworks, standards that would help the defense industry build these weapons in a responsible way and deploy them responsibly. And I think the research community has responded to that need in some ways. So there are initiatives in the AI community that look to educate researchers or use the voice they have in various sectors to raise those issues with decision makers. That said, most of the research in AI is potentially funded by defense. And there is always this conflict of doing research with the defense companies that look to use tools that don't look like they will be using autonomous weapons, but have a dual purpose. So it's a tricky thing to control. But I think developing standards and principles and education is key, I think, to ensuring that these weapons are built responsibly, deployed responsibly, and also regulated responsibly.
Lord Hamilton, did you want to come in?
Yes, please. I would very much just like to return to the whole question of international humanitarian law. I think you've indicated that it would be very difficult to get any agreement to expand the spectrum of international humanitarian law, not least because the Russians refuse to even entertain the idea of signing up to any of this and won't even talk about it. Surely there's a reverse side of the same coin. and that is that the existing signatories to international humanitarian law have done so because it's largely meaningless, by which I mean that the only charge it seems anybody can stand up on this law is war crimes. And as they know, the chances of ever proving or having anybody guilty of war crimes is absolutely sort of very small percentage. That's where they're prepared to sign up to it, because they know that nothing will ever happen under IHL.
Who would like to come in on this briefly, if we may, because we're running out of time?
I'm not a law expert, but I'd defer to my expert colleagues on my team. But I think when it comes to proving, who's at fault, I think that's where AI-based systems can potentially be equipped with data tracking, provenance tracking toolkits that would help us prove, guilt in situations where war crimes might be committed. I think establishing standards around that may help a bit with enforcement of these laws, but I would defer to my expert law colleagues to provide a view on this.
Dr. Diggelen, are you a bit more optimistic than Lord Hamilton?
Well, I think that an important result of this effort and these discussions that we are having is also to become more aware of unforeseen risks of this technology, because we just don't know very well how this will play out if we deploy AI in all sorts of domains. And to become aware of that, I think that's in the benefit of every country, and that will definitely benefit humanity.
I know Lord Brown would like to come in very quickly, but could we keep it very brief?
It's just that, this is a global challenge, right? We can't insulate ourselves from this, when I was the Secretary of State for Defence, people were telling me that, in 5 years' time, and they were right, that, soldiers would go to war with iPads, right? Now, so it's all very well for us to, sort of talk about what others are not doing. At least what we can do in this Parliament is decide what we should be doing. But we've also got to bear in mind, I don't have my iPad with me, but I have my iPhone with me. And if you want to see just how internationally connected we are, look at the back of your iPhone. It says designed in California and assembled in China. So I don't know whether the bits were manufactured, but it was assembled in China. And I guarantee you it says the same in the back of an iPad. So we're giving our soldiers this. We're giving them something that the Chinese have assembled. And we're not likely to get anybody else to assemble them because we can do it cheaper there than anywhere else. And so we're interconnected, and we have to realise the degree to which we are interconnected and work on this. And we should take people like Eric Schmidt seriously when they say, AI, not just in autonomous weapons or in weapon systems or in driverless cars, but they just say it exposes potentially an existential risk to the human race. So we need these may be uncomfortable and worrying things for us and difficult and hurt our heads, and they do, but we need to engage with them. And we should learn from how we've done it with other technologies, I think.
Bearing that point in mind, I'd like to draw to a close with a question we've been putting to all witnesses, and I think, Lord Fairfax, you're going to put that question, and perhaps, as I say, if you do want to respond in your answer to Lord Brown's point, please feel free to do that.
If each of you could make one recommendation to the UK government in this area, what would it be?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Calder, thank you.
Mine will be a conjunction. That means it's one thing and another. The first is we need consensus about human agency in these systems, and then we design capability around supporting that. So it's not about the technology per se, it's about designing to some human agency, to support some human agency. For example, weapons firing. And the second is, don't underestimate the power of the international science community. And I think it's extremely important that we stay connected. And the last thing is, there's a bit of hype at the moment. I don't think we've just fallen off a cliff edge. This is just a continuum of software development and automation.
Thank you. Professor Ramchurn.
I'll go back to my initial point, which is I think we need to set up a council that would look at bringing different stakeholders to have these conversations around meaningful human control and all these issues that we just talked about. Try and achieve consensus, but I don't think we will always achieve that consensus in some cases. And I think the point about getting away from the hype, trying to take away that narrative from the media, and I think as a professor of AI, I don't see AI as posing an existential risk. I think climate change is probably more likely to cause that risk. So I think we need to now take charge of that conversation and acknowledge it is a sensitive issue, and the public should be involved in there. I think ethicists, philosophers, engineers, and computer scientists and lawmakers, all great people to involve in that conversation. But at the end of the day, the public will have to put our politicians in parliament and will decide on who's most effective at defending the nation. So engaging a national conversation and engaging the public in that national conversation would be my advice to the government.
Thank you very much. Dr. Diggelen.
Yeah, so my advice would be to look broader than the weapon systems and look at all ways in which AI will be deployed in the military, and that will likely be part of a systems of systems where many interacting components communicate, and maybe the AI will be used as a decision support system upon which humans will base their further decisions. And eventually, this could very well lead to the use of weapons. But then it's a little bit more disguised than a discussion around autonomous weapon systems. And well, AI as an information processing entity is a very common application, and I think we will see the first applications of AI in defense like that. And that is also we can lose control over these systems as well.
Professor Jurriaan van Diggelen, Professor Dame Murray, Muffy, Calder, and Professor Gopal. Ramchurn, we're very, very grateful for your time, for the thought you've put into this session, and it's been hugely stimulating, and you've helped us with our thinking